Hey guys, Paul Warburg back here in Utah today. Today let's talk about tariffs and trade wars. Are they a good idea? Do they actually work? And what are some things that we should probably consider about this that not a lot of people seem to be thinking about? First, I want to apologize for the harsh lighting in this video. Obviously, I am standing in the middle of the Utah desert here. But the reason I've done that is because in the background of today's video are a couple of illustrations that will help me tell today's story. Because here around me are the fingerprints of the economic history of this area that show how just because economies change doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. And there's three things surrounding me that I want to point out before I get into the video. Over my right shoulder here is the Great Saltaire. You can barely make it out, I know it's blurry, but this was once one of the world's most famous resorts. All sorts of famous people used to come here, and it was a very profitable, cool place to be. Today it sits abandoned because the shores of the Great Salt Lake have receded, and actually they're further in that direction while the resort is behind me. So there is one economic fingerprint of this area that is now defunct. Now over my left shoulder is another economic fingerprint, and I think today it is actually still the tallest freestanding structure west of the Mississippi River. And what that is it is actually part of a smelter used for copper that is brought in from one of the world's biggest copper mines a little bit further to the south. So there is another economic fingerprint of this area. But far to my right, a little bit out of frame, is Salt Lake City and a new and upcoming industry area called the Silicon Slopes. And the reason that this area is called the Silicon Slopes is similar to if you've heard of Silicon Valley in the San Francisco area, where there are a lot of thriving tech jobs that are making Salt Lake City currently one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. My point in pointing all these things out is you can see how the economic history of this area has changed over time from leisure to include copper mining, natural resources to now include tech. But with all of these changes that the area has undergone, obviously the city is still thriving, proving that just because an economy changes doesn't mean it's the end of the world. Now let's take that thought on a local level and zoom out to the national level. A lot of people are talking about tariffs right now, and the reason people are talking about tariffs is because here in the United States, a lot of people are feeling disenfranchised because the United States used to be one of the world's predominant manufacturing powerhouses, where much of the goods that were consumed by the outside world were produced by the United States. But of course, now that is no longer the case. That is making a lot of people upset because their way of life has completely changed. And because of that, politicians have come in and have brought up the policies of tariffs to speak to these voters who predominantly live in swing states to try to earn their votes. Now, the question I want to ask today is, in light of that, aside from helping politicians get elected, is there an actual benefit to tariffs, or is there something that we're missing? And to do that, of course, I need to first explain what a tariff is for people who may or may not understand it. A tariff at its most basic level is basically just a tax on goods that are being imported into your country from other countries. And the idea behind a tariff is that if you can make it more expensive for foreign manufacturers to send their goods into your country, you can protect domestic industry, and therefore perhaps you can protect domestic jobs. For example, the manufacturing jobs in Pennsylvania and Michigan, particularly centered around the creation of automobiles. So that is the theory behind tariffs, that they help benefit a national economy at the expense of other nations. But how does this theory actually play out in practice? And here it's very important that we actually look at historical examples, because believe it or not, this is not the first point in history where someone has gotten elected by appealing to tariffs and thereby appealing to outside enemies as the cause for the decline of industry within a nation. This has actually happened throughout history several different times, and the results have always been consistent. So one of the first examples to look at in US history is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was implemented in 1930 around the time of the Great Depression. The idea was that everybody in the United States was unemployed. We have to protect domestic industry. These tariffs were implemented, and guess what happened? The Great Depression got worse because there were unforeseen impacts of implementing these tariffs that the politicians who implemented them weren't thinking about. Then we fast forward to another set of tariffs that were implemented in 2002 by President George W. Bush. These tariffs were implemented on selected steel products to protect U.S. steel, because U.S. Steel has historically been a very big employer in the United States, and it was getting outdone by foreign competitors. What ended up happening in this case was the same as the tariffs in the 1930s. It made the problem worse. And what was actually found out was that there were 10 times as many people in the U.S. who depended on cheap foreign steel to keep their companies afloat as there were people who depended on the income from U.S. steel being produced and sold. And the net result was that more jobs were lost than were saved. This is a theme that we will see with tariffs pretty much any time we look at them. They sound good in theory, they protect a certain category of workers, but everybody else tends to suffer. Now, people could be forgiven for implementing these tariffs because there weren't a lot of well-cited studies that they could lean on. But the third set of tariffs that I want to discuss can't be given the same leeway, because this set of tariffs came in the United States in 2018, and once again, it targeted the steel industry, even after all the data was available from the previous tariffs that targeted the steel industry. This was when Donald Trump implemented a 25% tariff on steel products to protect jobs in the steel industry in the United States. And after this tariff was implemented, it was found that it didn't actually help. And because of the knock-on effects, what ended up happening was, even in spite of this tariff, U.S. steel jobs overall declined from around 84,000 when it was implemented to around 80,000 just 2 years later. Again, not a catastrophic decline in the steel industry in particular, but all the knock-on effects were the same. So given all of these historical examples, I want to posit something about tariffs that everybody should recognize, and then I'll defend that throughout the video. And that is that tariffs provide a theoretical but unproven benefit in exchange for a well-cited catastrophic risk. In other words, the benefits of tariffs have never been proven, but the risks of tariffs are well-cited and can be easily found by anybody who looks for them. What ends up happening with tariffs is that politicians implement them, usually with good intentions, but there are several knock-on effects down the line that they don't anticipate. So what I want to do in this video now is to talk about a lot of those knock-on effects so that we can anticipate them, because there's a good chance these tariffs are going to happen no matter what. And it's good for us to be able to anticipate what the actual impacts of them might be. Then I want to close the video by talking about why manufacturing is actually declining in the United States and demonstrating why implementing tariffs can't solve the underlying problems. So let's first start by talking about the unforeseen risks inherent in tariffs. One of the first problems with tariffs is that they underestimate the complexity and the degree to which the world is now globalized, like it or not. The reality is that anything that is made in the United States probably has components or pieces or natural resources that are coming from another country. And so to implement a tariff to protect U.S. industry, what almost always happens, like in the case of the steel tariffs, is that the people in other industries across the country suffer. But there's also another problem with tariffs, and that's that the only types of jobs that tariffs can really protect are manufacturing jobs. And people don't really think about what that does to other jobs across the country, even if you do manage to successfully protect some manufacturing jobs. So let's start with cars as an example, because obviously automobiles are a big part of the current tariff conversations in the United States. If you were to look at the stock market the day after Donald Trump was elected, and you were to compare a foreign automaker like Toyota to a domestic automaker like Tesla, you would have seen a huge difference. The Tesla stock would have gone way up, and the Toyota stock would have gone way down. And that was, of course, because just before the election, Donald Trump had threatened that any manufacturers of automobiles that were manufacturing in Mexico would see a massive tariff if they wanted to sell to American consumers. So it sounds like that protected an American company. So what's the harm? What's the flaw? Well, let's think about this a few levels deeper than just the stock price. And actually, let's start with the stock price. Because think about it. Just because Toyota is a foreign company doesn't mean that it's all foreigners who own the Toyota stock. A huge percentage of the people who own that Toyota stock that lost a lot of money were Americans who owned that stock and were effectively the owners of this company. So there's just one unforeseen impact right off the bat where you're not helping Americans and hurting foreigners. You're just helping one class of Americans or one category of Americans and hurting another category of Americans. Now, if you look a level deeper, you will see how this fact matriculates throughout the entire process, where it's not Americans being benefited, it's just a certain category of Americans being benefited. Because if you think about the auto industry, it is a whole lot more than just the people who are manufacturing automobiles in Detroit. Although that is a very concentrated class of voters, and I'll return to that in just a moment. But if you think about the automobile industry, if you go to any city in America, you will find auto dealers from a lot of different manufacturers. And a lot of those auto dealers sell foreign cars. If domestic manufacturers get a massive benefit because of tariffs and foreign companies are caused to suffer, that could close a lot of these dealerships to close down across the country. Now, these aren't manufacturing jobs, these are sales jobs, these are clerical jobs, these are accounting jobs, and all the different jobs that go on in a dealership, but they're still American jobs. And what you will see is the net impact of protecting domestic manufacturers will be that a lot of other classes of Americans will lose their jobs. Now, these people aren't as critical to a politician because these are just a few people here and there across every state. They're not going to decisively change the outcome of an election, whereas the people who are concentrated in manufacturing powerhouses like Detroit, having strong messaging that appeals to those people, now that can shift an election if it causes their entire state to shift in your favor. And so now you can kind of see why this tariff conversation goes on. It's not about actually protecting American jobs. It's about getting American votes in targeted areas. Now, all of this has been focused on the automaking industry, but of course this applies to other industries as well across the country. If we think of consumer electronics, for example, you can think of all the jobs from the people who offload those goods at ports and put them on transportation to be transported to certain parts of the country, all the way down to the jobs of the people who work at, for example, Best Buy, which could suffer from tariffs because prices of consumer goods would go up and it would be a lot harder for them to make a profit. All of these are just some of the potential risks of a tariff. And these types of examples could go all throughout the economy. And they could be so thorough that we actually can't predict specifically what will happen. We just know that there's going to be a lot of really bad things that will happen. With that in mind, everything up to this point has also made a certain assumption. And that has been that while there are risks to the tariffs, at least there is the benefit that it benefits domestic manufacturing. But as it turns out, even that benefit likely isn't dependable. And that's for a very specific reason. If you think about what a tariff is and who implements it, the president, you start to realize a real hole in the whole tariffs philosophy. Because here in the United States, we change presidents every 4 to 8 years. And in particular, Donald Trump will only be president for 4 years because he's already served one term and he's going to hit his term limit. The next guy who comes into office could choose to reverse those tariffs or take those tariffs away. And what that means is that the benefit of tariffs is never actually dependable enough for companies to leverage it to its maximum advantage. Think about it. If this president is saying he's going to protect domestic manufacturing jobs, and you go and you build a multi-million-dollar facility, or maybe even a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing facility, and the next guy comes in and reverses that policy, that investment could go belly up. So from a practical standpoint, a lot of companies are going to be nervous about trying to scale up and really leverage the benefit that the tariffs bring. So again, as I said earlier, the benefit is theoretical but unproven, and actually I will add unlikely, while the risks are proven and very well cited and very likely. So up to this point, I've been talking about manufacturers and industry and jobs, which is important, but there's also another important category to this conversation, which is perhaps even more important, which is the consumer. And the consumer is perhaps more important because everybody in a country is a consumer, while only a small portion of the country is involved in manufacturing and producing physical goods. So how do tariffs impact consumers? First, I want to start out by pointing out a really kind of funny inconsistency that I find here, which is that if you ask the people who are promoting tariffs how tariffs will impact consumers, they will say they're not going to impact consumers at all because the cost is going to be borne by the companies that are importing the goods. In other words, China is going to pay for the tariffs, not the American consumer. And I see there's a funny inconsistency here because there is an inconsistency in this economic approach with other things that people who argue for tariffs often say. A lot of times, not across the board, but a lot of times people who argue for tariffs are also people who argue against, for example, minimum wage increases. Because what they will say is that if you artificially increase wages, companies are just going to raise prices and you're going to have to pay more anyways. That is the argument they use to try to prevent minimum wage from going up. But these same people will tell you that when you artificially add a tax to a good, the companies that are importing those goods are just going to eat those costs rather than passing them on to the consumers. I hope you can see the inconsistency here. The point is that if you actually take the time to think about a tariff and what it is and what it does, it is a fundamentally anti-free market approach to economics, which ironically is inconsistent with what a lot of the people arguing for tariffs say they believe about the world. That aside, when you increase a cost, it is a fact that companies will pass that cost on to their consumers. We have seen that happen time after time throughout human history, and we know that that is always what happens. There's almost nothing that you can do to prevent it. You can argue whether that's good or not, but you shouldn't deny it. So with that in mind, that brings us to the next way that tariffs will negatively impact consumers, and it has to do with what happens when you artificially manipulate markets like we've just discussed. What happens when you artificially manipulate a market isn't just that you increase costs, but perhaps more importantly, you reduce quality. When you don't have as much competition, we all know that your business is not going to have an incentive to produce as high quality of a good. This is one of the big arguments that in America is always made against communism, and I think it's accurate. So we have to apply it to tariffs too. If we look at our history as a country, again looking at automobiles, a lot of people will know that there's a lot of jokes about American automobile manufacturers that go back in time. For Ford, there is an acronym that's used as a joke called Found on Road Dead. I know a lot of people who used to drive Dodge cars that will never buy a Dodge car again because the quality was so poor. Nowadays, though, American automobile manufacturers are pretty high quality. And the reason for that is because foreign automakers like Toyota and Honda and Mazda came into the market, and they were absolutely destroying these manufacturers when it came to quality. And so American consumers were tending towards them. A lot of people became purists where they would never buy an American car, and even today still won't because they never kicked the habit, because the foreign cars were such better quality. And so we just have to think about what's going to happen if we artificially attempt to reverse this trend and we're successful. We might protect the jobs, but we'll all have a hard time getting to work because our cars will be breaking down 10 times a day on our way there. Now, joking aside, this also speaks to another of the false narratives that is often introduced in the tariff conversation, which is that when you talk about tariffs, one of the things that people will often bring up is how high quality stuff that is made in America is, and how low quality stuff that is manufactured overseas is. And this is just one historical example that shows that that hasn't always necessarily been true. We actually needed foreign competition to make American manufacturing high quality. And even today, a lot of the high quality goods that we as Americans enjoy are not manufactured in the United States and could not be manufactured in the United States. That goes from everything from the camera in front of me to the microphone in front of me to the phone in my pocket. A lot of these things are designed in the United States with really high paying jobs helping design them, and then manufactured overseas. Now, it's important to bring up that truth, even though some people might be offended by it, because it turns out this is not actually a bad thing. It is actually okay that the United States is not the world's manufacturing powerhouse, and that's what I want to close our video talking about today. And I know this part of the video might be a little unsettling to individuals who may have built their lives on a manufacturing career, but I want to talk about the country as a whole. And I want to go back to the examples I started this video with all the different industries around me, some that have been lost to the past, but clearly the city over there is still able to prosper. So why is manufacturing not as important as we often claim that it is? What a lot of people don't realize is that the reason the United States is the largest economy on Earth today, and in fact in human history, is precisely because we are an economy that is not entirely focused on manufacturing. And this was not an accident, it was actually somewhat intentional. A brief history of manufacturing in the United States is that the reason this was so profitable for us in the past was because there was a period of time where we were manufacturing as pretty much the only technologically advanced manufacturer in the world. Because after World War II, pretty much every other manufacturing center on the planet was devastated and destroyed, whether that be in Europe or in Asia. The United States then rode that manufacturing boom and made a lot of money doing it, but they chose to use the money they made from manufacturing to transition into other, far more profitable industries. I mentioned that the phone in my pocket was designed in the United States, but manufactured in another country. I also mentioned earlier the Silicon Slopes, and there's also Silicon Valley, that bring a lot of money into our country. Sums of money that manufacturing can't even begin to touch. The United States did this as a conscious choice because they did not want to be an economy that was built around manufacturing. They wanted to be an economy that was built around high tech, because that is what America as a country has all the advantages in. Basically, the United States had a competitive advantage in manufacturing for a time, but then they converted that competitive advantage into something else once that competitive advantage began to get eroded. At that time, pretty much any country in the world was capable of doing manufacturing the way the United States did it, provided that they were able to rebuild their infrastructure. So once all these other countries rebuilt their infrastructures and they had huge populations looking for jobs like the ones that were in the manufacturing sector, the United States realized that we wouldn't be able to compete in manufacturing forever. So what we did across the country, basically as a whole, was we used that money to build up the capital-intensive industries where we would have such an edge because we got started so much earlier that nobody else would ever really be able to catch up. That is why the United States is focused as an economy more around white-collar jobs than blue-collar jobs. It is not because the elites got around and decided that they wanted to ruin the lives of all the people that were making their living working in factories. It was because the United States could not keep that competitive edge for the long term. What we're seeing now is this desire for Americans to go back into industries where we don't have a competitive edge and where actually other countries like China, etc., have built up technological edges in these specific industries. It is a losing prospect to focus on the industries of yesterday rather than focusing on the strengths of what you can do as a country tomorrow. People who talk about the loss of manufacturing in the United States rarely talk about the fact that the US became the predominant global economy during that time, because they are focused on what they lost rather than on what they gained. So we should really think about that before we try to implement things like tariffs to bring yesterday back, without acknowledging the benefits that come from the world we live in today. I hope you guys have enjoyed this analysis. Let me know if I missed anything. And if you guys enjoyed this, can I ask a quick favor? Would you consider supporting my work by becoming a patron? It's completely voluntary. I'm not going to put any of this content behind a paywall, but I really enjoy doing the research and production behind these videos, and your support helps me to do that more often and to invest in a higher quality experience for everybody. So I appreciate that. If you want to learn more about that, check out the QR code on screen or the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, like, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.